Last day we were talking about Islam from various angles, particularly the immense leap forward, both spiritually and culturally, that resulted from the revelation of the Quran, the way in which mind and heart came together in a whole civilization, the extraordinary advance that the Quran's teachings, and particularly Muhammad's own example gave with respect to racial tolerance. The Quran, you could say, was standing at the threshold of modernity, and particularly this was the most important, I suppose, of all of the teachings that the Quran gives us, is an acceptance of all of the great religions, an acceptance of the work of all of the prophets of God. And I wanted to read a specific statement that reflects this, or one of the many statements. The Quran says, "We believe in God and the revelation given unto us, and to Abraham, Ismail, Isaac, and Jacob, and that given to Moses, and to Jesus, and that given to all of the prophets from their Lord." This is a very different approach to religion than humanity had been familiar with. And of course the response to it of minds like Rumi and Ibn Khaldun and Ibn Sina and Ibn Rushd and all these great thinkers, they were simply liberated by this whole new conception of reality and its welcome of the use of the mind. For instance, one of the hadiths, I think it is, says, "Search for knowledge even unto China." It was this liberality that was so characteristic of Islam. Now, theoretically, a great breakthrough should have taken place in terms of a recognition of process, recognition of some kind of evolutionary process. It didn't happen. And the question is, why didn't it? The reason it didn't, of course, was because of the growth of Islamic theology, a theological system that began to grow on the surface of what you could call Islamic thought, or the thought throughout Islamic civilization. Because in Islamic theology, there is, of course, only one religion, but that religion was given whole and perfectly at the beginning by God. It was given to the Jews, and essentially Islamic theology says that the Jews failed to respond properly, and they even went to the extent of corrupting their own scriptures, so they didn't have to respond to God. This is the theory. So God took it from them, and he gave it to the second group of people, to the Christians. And the Christians did exactly what the Jews had done. They too corrupted the scriptures so that they didn't have to really be faithful to the revelation of God. It was taken away from them, and it was given to the Arab people, and according to Islamic theology, the Arabs, at last, God had found a people who were able to accept the revelation as God intended it and to follow it. Well, it was simply one faith repeated over and over again, instead of an opening to the idea of process. So one has to ask oneself, what happened? Why is a failure from a civilization that was so liberal, so creative, that had embraced such a wide diversity of cultural and religious and aesthetic impulses? Well, what happened was what had always happened. The most severe warning that the Quran gives, and it appears several places throughout the Quran, is against what the Quran calls joining partners with God. Let me read you a passage that, there are many passages, but this one, the Quran says, "Say, The things that my Lord hath indeed forbidden are shameful deeds, whether open or secret, sins and trespasses against truth or reason, the assigning of partners to God, for which he hath given no authority, and saying things about God of which ye have no knowledge. Well, this is a perfect description of theology in a nutshell. And what the Islamic clergy did as they gradually, very slowly began to impose their control on Islamic civilization was to create, for example, the Sharia. They drew from the Quran, allegedly, so they claimed, all of the basic laws that should govern human behavior, but they then codified these laws in a system which ultimately became, tragically, a wall between the believer. Instead of being a doorway for the believer into the mind and will of God, it became a wall between the believer and the Quran. And of course, this is the old story of theology's work throughout the history of other religions as well. But the result in this case, of course, was that the West, which which by this time was beginning to lose where Christianity, the Judeo-Christian religious system, was beginning to lose its grip, the West was able to take from, and I think we talked about this the other day, was able to take from Islam those superficial features that were beneficial to civilization without paying any attention to the Quran itself. But the consequence was that it simply overwhelmed Islam. And throughout all of these tentative approaches of Islamic civilization through Spain, through Sicily, through Italy, up through the Balkans and to the very gates of Vienna, this was arrested, and then the Great Retreat began until today. Islam is simply, the Islamic societies of the world today are history's great failures. They are systems which are failing completely to respond to the challenge of modernity. And this was a society in the 19th century that the Bab addressed. You could say, I think, almost as an act of divine mercy, he clothed his message in the familiar terms of Islamic theology, because these were the people he was speaking to. For a Westerner reading the Bab's writings, it's very, very difficult to contrast the Bab's writings with those of Baha'u'llah. Baha'u'llah, you understand exactly what he's saying, because the principles are not clothed in Islamic concepts from a previous age. But for the bright young students in the seminaries throughout Iran, this was truly a revelation in their experience of it, as well as in its actual origins. One would tend today, I think, to think of seminarians as not exactly on the cutting edge of scholarship. But in Iran, that's what was possible. Theology was the very cutting edge of scholarship for it. And these young people responded, these young men particularly in these seminaries responded with tremendous enthusiasm to the Bab's teachings. Because of course there was nothing in their experience that came close to it. He opened the concept, for example, of progressive revelation itself. Suddenly they saw all of the revelations not merely as the same religion repeated over and over again, but as a steadily unfolding process. He explained to them that the day of resurrection was the day on which the next stage in this process was revealed to those who were prepared to, with open minds for it. He explained that heaven and hell were metaphors, not some place up in the sky or down on the earth or something, but metaphors for conditions of the human heart and human consciousness. He dismissed the Sharia completely and the authority of the mullahs along with it. He took the Arabic language. It's very difficult for us in the West to really understand the role that the Arabic language plays in Islam as a religion. According to Muslim traditional thought, the Quran really cannot be translated. You have to learn Arabic to learn the Quran, because the language is so woven into the concepts in which it attempts to convey. Well, what the Bab did was to take that language and just stretch it apart, just open it up. If words didn't adequately communicate, so if a particular word didn't adequately communicate a concept that he had, then he would add suffixes to it or prefixes to it, or apply it as a verb instead of as a noun or something. He was free to do this. And after all, the Word of God, we know from all religious history, the Word of God, it is that power that creates grammar, that creates literature, not the other way around. You don't have a bunch of theologians creating a system of grammar, and then God at long last is able to speak to people being very careful to worry about antecedents and so on. But that was one of the things that attracted bright young minds to the Bab, and it was the thing, ironically, that the so-called intellectual leaders of Shia Islam objected to so strongly, and they dismissed the Bab because they said, well, you can't even speak proper Arabic. He could speak proper Arabic by their terms when circumstances required it, but that was not his concern principally. And he also, he used the authority of prophethood. He used his prophetic authority to gradually wean these followers, these new followers, away from some of the rigid laws that the Quran had contained for an earlier period of history. A good example was jihad. He didn't argue about jihad. He spoke about jihad because that was part of the discourse of the time. But he insisted that jihad could not be used by his followers without his permission, and he refused to give his permission. So there was no jihad. These marches that his followers made across Iran were not attacks. They didn't initiate any kind of hostilities. They were bottled up in Sanjan and in Port Tabarsi and so on. They defended themselves, but they did not exercise the jihad that it was familiar to them from Islamic backgrounds. Well, this is a tragedy, an immense tragedy. And it's a tragedy for the whole of humankind, because once again, and after all, this was not the first time in the evolution of religion, once again, precisely that segment of mankind who had been prepared for the new day by the revelations of the past, that was the very segment that refused it and that attempted to crush it. And the reason, of course, is because, as Baha'u'llah points out, people were willing to submit themselves to the leadership, to the control and direction of a special elite group in the society, the clergy, who were, sadly, the most corrupt, the most ignorant, venal, and really vicious element in the society. The result of that, of course, was that Islamic society began this long descent to the point that today Islamic countries are severely handicapped in any way in responding to the demands of modernity. It's not only Westerners who are today open to whatever modernity requires of them, but the whole world is, whether it's China or India or Latin America. Everybody's open, everybody except Islamic society, the society that should be at the very forefront of that response. It's a tragedy because, yes, these people, the Islamic society, had transformed civilization. They transformed not only their own countries when Muhammad began teaching, they transformed eventually Europe and the rest of the world too. Yes, they had penetrated more deeply into the divine purpose than had the earlier religions, and they applied those teachings as we mentioned last day. And yes, the whole world benefited. Not just Islamic countries benefited from that, but the whole world, usually indirectly, but nevertheless the benefits were experienced by mankind generally. But what they forgot was that what they forgot in our day, as human beings always do, they forgot that this power was the power of God, of the divine revelations. It was not owing to their own superiority as a people over the rest of the people of the world. And the consequence is the catastrophe that religion is bringing on supposedly religion, is bringing on mankind today. That catastrophe that results from ignoring the warning of the Quran, that joining partners with God, elevating ordinary human beings, no matter how educated they are, to the point that they are, and they alone, are the interpreters of the will of God, rather than the fact that people generally should be trained to have access to the Quran or the Bible or the Gospel or something. This acceptance of the control by elite groups is what paralyzes the religious impulse and prevents it from achieving the full effects that are possible. And let me just conclude these comments by reading words of Muhammad in one of the hadiths, the traditions, which is accepted throughout Islam by both Shia and Sunni. And it's very, very sobering. Muhammad warned, during his own lifetime, he warned that the day would come when, in his words, there will remain of Islam not but a name, and of the Quran not but a mere appearance. The learned of that day, the ulama, the learned of that day shall be the most evil the world hath seen. Mischief proceedeth from them, and on them it will recoil.